letter that we have on LinkedIn. I wanted to welcome you all. If you just are clicking in, tell us where you're coming in from. Today, we wanted to discuss you and your opportunity to shine in your career. See, if your skills are in demand, you are in demand. And in the 2023 most top in demand skills by the latest LinkedIn report, communication, leadership, and teamwork made the top of the list. So, what we decided to do is have a live where some of my colleagues and I talk about this very important communication skill. We're going to start with a warm up and we're going to talk about does it take to be a stellar communicator. I'm going to ask my guests really what comes to top of mind for them. But then we'll break it down. As you communicate your own brand in a face to face interaction, what matters? What are some tips that will be helpful? When you communicate in teams, what are some tips that are helpful there? When you communicate your electronic brand or your brand on a platform, how do you communicate effectively and how are you memorable? And finally, if we get to it, I hope, what are some of the very important sticky situation communication tactics that our guests today will advise you to stick with? We're going to leave by me asking them to tell us how they best train for being good communicators. So, since communication was a top on demand skill, I wanted to be sure that we discuss this today. As I said, just jump in on the comments and tell us where you're coming in from if you want to post that on the comment link. Let me welcome my first guest. Bonnie Hagemann is coming into the live. Do we have Bonnie in the stage? And as she's coming in, I'm going to tell you that Bonnie is a fireball. I met Bonnie in a LinkedIn instructor meeting, and we were talking about the in-demand skills. And we said, we need to do a live. And Bonnie said, I've never been invited to a live. Brenda and I said, well, you are now. So here she is. Carla, thanks for coming in from Mexico. So Bonnie is the CEO of EDA, a company that develops leadership and culture and helps companies excel in whatever they do. She also is a LinkedIn author with several courses, and the one that we're highlighting and discussing today is the course called Leading with Vision, which has quite a few communication tips. But if you are leading a team, leading a group, leading an organization, Bonnie is your go-to person. Bonnie, thanks for joining us.
Oh, thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be on
my friend Sarah Pasco from Arizona. Yes. Happy evening. Good evening, Kalug from India, and our friends in Brazil and Maryland and North Carolina. Thank you all so much for joining us. Our other guest, I couldn't probably share this course, Communication Foundations, that made it to the top of the list without having Brenda Bailey-Hughes, my dear friend and business partner and co-LinkedIn instructor who's coming in from the back of the scene. So you will see, and you've heard Brenda and I discuss communication quite often. We both teach it at the Kelley School of Business. Brenda has authored numerous courses. We have many of the ones that hit the top of the list because we try to make our content very practical. Brenda is the instructor for several courses, some really good top ones on building trust, which has lots of communication tips, and also on dealing with procrastination, how to put a little plug in for that. Let's see, we have Amir joining us from Iraq. My goodness, thank you. We are very grateful that you're taking the time. We know you're in a different time zone. And we have someone from Nigeria. Wonderful.
Athens just represented.
Yep. And we have my Greek friends, my people are coming in strong. Tasso, thank you for being here. Kalispera. So as we get started, I thought, because we try to keep this managed time-wise, but we want to make sure we answer your questions and give you lots of tips. The warm-up question, before we start getting into the specifics, is what I asked all of you to share with me is, what do you think makes for a stellar communicator? What does a stellar communicator bring to the table? And I told my guests that I would leave them a little bit of time to think about their answers. So I'll jump in and share. Oh my gosh, Corfu, one of the most beautiful islands in Greece. We have so many of them. What does it take to be a stellar communicator? Before I ask Bonnie and Brenda to share, I will say in many different facets, a stellar communicator is a person who is authentic. They don't change their style and their ways. They're flexible, but they are truthful and they are always speaking from the heart in the situation. But you can tell that they're not faking it. They are who they are. Courage, I love it. Melissa, please share what you all think is very confidence and competence. I showed that a little bit on our confidence. Yes, absolutely. Listen and to hear and not to reply. Engagement and connectivity. Orlando, welcome and thank you. So, my friends, I ask you, what do you think makes a stellar communicator? I'm going to continue to share what some of our guests are saying. You can both jump in, or maybe Bonnie, jump in.
Well, I agree with everything I'm seeing coming up here, and as well as what you said, but also I'd add to that just clarity. You know, it really, the more clear we can be with our communication, the better.
Absolutely. Clarity. Brenda?
Oh, I'm agreeing with, so my top two are listening, and I see your learners are already all over that. And I think that one's an interesting one because so often we think of communication as a sort of active process where our mouths are moving and we're making points and we're being persuasive. But I really do believe that the root of good communication is more in listening. And I was going to say it's passive. It's not. It is an active process, but it's not us speaking. So that would be my number one. But I think your listeners have already snagged that one. So I'll go with my number two then, which is being very audience centric. So whoever my listener is, I'm authentically me, but I'm also changing the approach I'm using, the amount of words I'm using, the kinds of words I'm using to make sure that I'm really dialing into the specific listener that I'm working with at that time.
Absolutely. And I said one, it's hard to choose just one. We have done this before. We've done a LinkedIn Live on listening alone, and we could continue to do this because it changes the situations that we're in, the ways that we listen, the ways that we communicate keep us quite often from listening and listening well. Thank you. I see some more people coming in from Bahrain and Costa Rica and Budapest and Italy. Fantastic. We have always have such an international audience. We appreciate you taking the time. The first question that I thought we would ponder in different settings and situations so we could all give tips was the situation where someone says to you, tell me a little bit about you. So the opportunity you have to verbally, not non-verbally, because we'll talk a little bit about your online presence or how you manage your brand specifically, but you are asked, tell me a little bit about you. Bonnie, from a communication standpoint, which pieces, and for all of you listeners, ask Bonnie or us all that specific question. What do you think is important? What tips do you have from our learners here?
Well, it's interesting because this was a big lesson for me. And it also, I was watching one of your courses this morning, Tatiana, and it was exactly what you said in one of your courses, which is to be very real and authentic about who you are, like bring that forward quickly. And so I learned that actually from my speaking coach. And so for years, I grew up in Western Oklahoma on a large farm, which is sort of in the middle of the country. And, you know, when I started getting into the corporate world, I hid all that. Like, I just didn't even say anything about it because I lived in the middle of the country. I was working on the coast, and I thought, you know, they might not value, you know, that background that I had. So I just really kept it a secret. And then I had this speaking coach. I just found him a few years ago. He's amazing. And he said to me, you know, he finally gets a story out of me about my dad. And I tell it in my speeches. And so from then on, he said, never, ever leave your background out again, because that is who you are. And so that was a big eye opener for me. And it's exactly what you were teaching in your class.
Yeah, it goes back to authenticity. Brenda?
That was such an awakening for me and Tatiana a few years ago. We had an opportunity to teach. We taught in the corporate space for years and years. And like you, Bonnie, we kind of pulled the pieces that we thought were appropriate for this very sort of buttoned up corporate experience. And then a friend said, we're going to be working with a new group, and they want sort of a mindful approach to communication. And what do you bring to that? And it was so interesting that as soon as he said mindful communication, this whole part of me that is on the yoga mat in the morning, that spends time meditating, that practices mindfulness, but was all a secret, like I'm not allowed to talk about that in a corporate setting. I felt unleashed to talk about it in that one specific example, but in that one course, because that's how they'd framed it. But then realized, Bonnie, that was who I was, and hiding that from the group was not helping. And I think, Tatiana, love your example of this around wellness and how that became not something to hide, but something to absolutely bring to the fore.
Yeah. Some of you know I have a big love for health and wellness and fitness. And I, for many years, hid that because I thought it was unprofessional to talk about me wearing spandex cycling shorts and teaching a class. And I've learned as I've matured in the profession that that's what makes me a better communicator. And it's okay to talk about that. And I wouldn't be losing face. In fact, I would probably gain some credibility because you juggle a lot of plates when you communicate in that setting as well. So for all of you listening here today, when someone says, tell me a little bit about you, you want to respond in a way that's authentic. First, you want to know who is asking. Quite often, maybe if it's just a casual ask, but if it's at a conference or if it's in a social setting that's maybe around a professional casual, cocktail hour where someone wants to remember you, remember that you don't want to hang on your resume and talk about things that they could go back and look. You want to tell a story or an example that will make you stand out. And in a course that Bonnie, you're referring to, it was a true story of a student who wanted to work for a big not pharmaceutical. He was coming from the pharmaceutical setting and wanted to work in agriculture and equipment. And I said, but why do you want to do this? And he started telling me that he spent summers on his grandpa's lap in the farm on the tractor trailer. And we build his pitch around that. And it was so much more authentic and knowing for him to communicate who he is. So anything that can be sticky, that people can remember you as. I even remember, and anytime we coach people, I had a student who created a mindfulness app, and he said it's like having a monk in your pocket. As he was pitching this idea, a monk in your pocket, boom, I still say this to this day. And it was the example that he gave of how he was resilient and resourceful and innovative, that you would remember him. So if you have any questions, another friend from Mumbai, India, I really appreciate you staying up late to be with us. So nice. So nice. Any other?
I wanted to point out. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Who's the speaking coach? Maybe you can add that on the notes, Bonnie. By the way, we also do that. So we want to make sure that you get to give some kudos to, I think you said it was a hymn. Yes. Any questions from our learners on how can you become an effective communicator when you're asked, tell me a little bit about you?
Yeah, while they're coming up with questions, I just wanted to add that so many of us, I loved Tatiana's idea that instead of just like the bullet points from the resume, we tell stories. And a lot of us have tons of great stories about ourselves that do help tell that story of who we are. Tell me about yourself. I am going to circle back to being audience specific, though. I think you can't tell all the stories. Yep. So pick the ones that are going to create that connection with the listener the best. Not to be inauthentic, because all of those stories are you, but which part of you comes to the forefront. You can be selective about that. I was working with a group just this week, a corporate group that works in manufacturing. And so when they said, tell us about you, I was telling them about how my dad worked on an automotive assembly line. And some of my earliest memories are going to the open houses and these automotive manufacturing plants. And that's where my first internship was. And those are stories that maybe I wouldn't tell somewhere else, not because they don't define me. They do. They definitely help shape who I am. But there are other stories that do as well. And if you're not manufacturing, that one might not create the connection as much.
Absolutely. And you spoke about the audience. So if say you're in in a setting that's a casual setting, someone says, tell me about you. And you can say, I have experience doing this, but just like your company, I'm intrigued by this. Anytime you can see the name of the company, the name of the person, you, us, I'm sure that the people in your introduction felt a little bit more connected to you. Gail says, so insightful. My climate at my current employer is that lockdown, nothing personal, which feels restrictive. Oh my goodness. Absolutely, Gail. That does feel restrictive. So I would recommend you just go out in coffee shops. And when people say, what do you do? Tell me a little bit about you. You can practice your personal pitch in that way.
Gail, you might also take a peek at my building trust class. The research says that people believe us. They decide whether to trust us or not based on authenticity, warmth, and credibility. And if we never talk about anything personal at work, if we're just really, like if you don't know if I have kids, if I live, where I live, what I do on the weekends, not that you have to bare your soul at work, but some of that does create trust. And so maybe you're the one that makes that happen.
Melissa's asking us, she worries about oversharing. Do you have any advice? Melissa, my thought initially with this is you have to read the room and you have to read the other person. I would have oversharing. I would say levels of oversharing, really high level of oversharing. You have to feel that it's safe and there's trusting relationship there to do that. But you can have sort of a 3 to 4 levels where you share a little bit, maybe a background story that makes you more authentic. And as you warm up or you move up in an interview setting, you can share a little bit more if someone asks a more specific question, or you can give a specific example. Bonnie, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so my first thought is just keep it short, and if they ask questions. So as long as you're keeping it short, you're probably not going to overshare, hopefully. But, try to get, like you said, something relevant out there. And then, if you're very curious about them, which is my tactic, because, when I go in to work a room or something, I go in with the attitude of all I have to do is be curious.
Yeah.
Right.
I love that.
If I'm really curious about them and I share a little bit about myself, then they will ask questions about what they'd really like to learn more about.
I love this comment by Diego. And Diego, this is why we do these lives. So people like you can ask these questions. He said, what about coming across as non-professional? I play the guitar and bias maybe. I love guitar, but never mentioned that avoid being seen as a hippie, frustrated musician. This is similar to what I did, not talking about having a background in exercise physiology, really believing that exercise is transformational and motivating people when I teach classes. Diego, depending on the level of comfort you have, if you're at a place in your career where you really, really, really need that job, I would just just be friendly and talk about your skills and your abilities in the fear of this. But it goes back to authenticity. Your guitar and your love for it is part of who you are. And if they don't want you because you may be perceived as a hippie, frustrated musician, they don't deserve you. I don't know, Brenda.
Well, and I know, I'm sure Bonnie's had this experience too. When I've been in interview committees and, when we're on the 7th or 8th candidate interview, they all start to get mixed up in my head. If there's that one that, isn't he the one that plays the guitar?
Yes.
That will trigger just a whole series of your answers for me. And then I'm like, okay, I remember him. And, that's helpful.
Yes, absolutely.
Tatiana, if I could weigh in there, I recently had a meeting with someone who was fairly high up in the government. And it was my first meeting with them. They were like over a small agency. And I just said, we just were getting to know each other. And he told me right away that he was in a band on the side at this whole other thing. And I loved it. Like, it really just opened the conversation. And, I think it was the best thing about our conversation.
Yeah, I love it.
This different side of himself.
Absolutely. And I see in the notes, John told Diego, everyone loves a musician and music is the language everyone can relate to. Yes. And that's what we want you to believe, Diego, specifically too. I want to jump into another situation where communication is really important. And that's why it's one of the top demand. And I go back to what Bonnie first said, conciseness. Because in a team setting, unlike when it's one-on-one with someone who says, tell me a little bit about you, all of us who are parts of working teams, of functional teams, of any kind of group, so maybe we oversee a team, we lead an organization, know that communication is critical in how we manage it, control what we control. I'm going to send this off to Brenda first. And Brenda has done some terrific research, even build a tool. I don't know if you were planning on talking about the way you measured team dynamics around communication. But what is one of your tips for all our learners who are participating today to know how to be good communicators in the context of a team?
Sure. Well, you've probably all heard the phrase psychological safety. I'm sure Bonnie can speak a lot to what that is, but one of the most micro skills associated with a team that is experiencing psychological safety, meaning we feel as though we can bring our full self to work. I can speak my true mind. I can disagree with you in an agreeable way, but I can push back. I can admit mistakes. All of those things that we know increase the performance of a team. So we want all of those factors to be there. And one of the ways that shows up is fairly equalized talk time on a team. So if you go to a meeting, there's not one person dominating the entire conversation. Maybe one-offs when that person was brought in because they're the expert and we're focusing in on a certain thing. But just generally, if the team is brainstorming, planning, making decisions, you see fairly equal talk time. I go to team after team after team for consulting work and say, do you equalize your talk time? Oh, yes, absolutely. Yeah, yep, definitely. We definitely have equalized talk time. I'm like, okay, that's great. Let's record your next meeting. And then
that's what I was talking about.
I actually audit who talks most, who talks the longest. There is rarely a team that has actually finessed equalized talking time. But if we can take baby steps toward that by noticing that someone hasn't spoken for a while and holding the floor for him or her, by inviting early on in the meeting women or minorities in the group that may otherwise feel less invited to speak out in these meetings. These are little tips and tricks that do help equalize that talk time. Even simple things like, let's take a moment and all gather our thoughts individually before we start talking out loud.
Sure.
That silent moment brings out your introverts, people who are multiple language speakers that are functioning and translating to some extent. And then when you go around the group and say, hey, what are your thoughts? Everybody's had time to have thoughts. More diverse ideas, more creative ideas when we make those simple adjustments to our team communication, and just things we can all do, whether we're the leader of that team meeting or we're just one of the participants. We can all make those adjustments.
Bonnie, what do you say about communicating? And that's on a lot of your courses, many of your courses in a team setting.
Yes. So there's two thoughts that I have to add to what Brenda's saying, and it goes along with it perfectly. One is that on the teams, when you have something important to ask, if you can send it out the day before, so that so the people who are more introverted and by nature have time to process internally, they'll bring their best answer to the table, and then go around the room and, make sure everyone, like you said, gets a chance to talk. And then also just pay attention. Like, if you can just see that they have something to say, but they're not saying it, stop and call that out. Say, what about you, Tatiana? What do you think?
Sure.
Pull that forward. Or even if it's just a face that just says, are you questioning this? I'd really like to hear your thoughts. Pull it out of them.
Pull it out of them. I was going to talk a little bit about communicating on email or communicating on different platforms. And Shilpa points out, I think modes of communication are also important. Oftentimes, some people prefer to chat than speak out. Any thoughts on that? My thought was, my tip for communicating in a team is also finding out what are people's preferences. Maybe I prefer to organize an email, send it out, and walk away. But that's my preferred style of communication. If I want to get Brenda's attention, I actually do this literally. We leave a meeting and I'll leave a voice memo. I don't even leave it or a recording with my train of thought, like listen to this when you have time, because I know that if I put it in an email, it will make no sense. I know that if I record it, it's probably more personable, and it takes away though from me calling her and asking for her attention when she can't, because she also needs time to process. So find out what's the preference of the other person in communication. Is it okay on a chat during a meeting, or do you need to check in with this person afterwards? But we live such busy lives. I want to go back to Bonnie's suggestion of conciseness. If you need to communicate within a group, I'm gonna jump on this one in just a second. If you need to communicate within a group, is to organize everything, at least if it's on email, make sure they see it in one image. Don't drag it on too much, or just build it as you would an actual presentation.
Hey, can I comment on Shilpa's comment about the chat?
Yes, yes.
So I do want to say, since so many of us said, hey, the best part of being a stellar communicator is being a good listener. I think there's listening etiquette in chats that we are completely violating, and that is interrupting. So when someone is on a roll and they're talking, and then someone else is filling up the chat and it's not expected, or it's completely off topic, I think we need to see that as just as interruptive as if,
oh yeah,
if Bonnie right now suddenly introduced a whole different topic, we would go like, that's not okay. But somehow we've decided that's okay in the chat. So I think, Shilpa, if your team has established some ground rules about how the chat is to be used that doesn't violate good listening, active listening norms, then I think the chat room has some real potential for people that prefer text over vocalizing.
I think so. Though the way this came up, if you're running a meeting or sometimes a webinar, I often say, I ask an open-ended question, and I'll say, open your mic or your camera, jump in, or write it in the chat. Because some people do not want to open up their mic or want to put it in the chat. Or maybe even say after a meeting, we don't have to discuss this or answer this right now. Let's take time. And that gives people the time to process too. But that goes back into knowing your audience's preference of how they communicate. That's important. You've asked, by the way, some really good questions and comments. And I promise you, after any of these, we go back, or I will go back and answer. Matthew, you had a very good question on how to avoid self-deprecating when you speak, but this needs a little bit more attention. So I want to bring it up maybe towards the end. So be patient with me, my friend. As we move forward, touching upon maybe the third pillar of the focus for today. So we talked about tips on communicating when someone says, tell me about you. Tips on communicating within a group, whether it's meeting or whether it's email correspondence afterwards. What about when we as individual contributors, communicate about us on a platform, whether that is individual intranet setting, or if it's LinkedIn or any other social media like Twitter or even TikTok? What do you think are good tips for our learners to be stellar communicators of their own brand? Brenda, what do you say?
I am a lover of words, so I hate that this is my advice, but it does seem like on many of the media platforms, visuals reign. And so I think being more attuned to how we're representing ourselves visually, even like I'm looking at that, you've got a logo in the top right-hand corner, You're Stronger Live with Tatiana Kolovu. Even that little piece of your brand, the word choice being so specific, the font being so specific. I know you've given thought probably to color schematic and all of that. I think those things matter more in social media platforms than they do when we're working face to face. And so for me, it's a push to be more attuned to that, because I rely so much on language, and yet the visual component of communication does have to be prioritized to some extent.
So check your LinkedIn profile picture and make sure it's not one from prom. We have a lot of undergrad students, trust me. I see things that need to not be there.
Or what background shows up when you're doing a video conference. I want to do a research study on, do the what do you call them? The placed
Faded.
the what?
Or the fake, yeah, the green
Yeah, the fake
screen.
backgrounds we keep saying authenticity, authenticity. Do those fake backgrounds hurt our authenticity? But if I don't have it and I've got a messy background, does that hurt my credibility? So I'd love to do some research on that and get a definitive answer to that. But I think being more attuned to visuals is where I would go around that answer.
Bonnie, what do you think on the social media platform piece?
Well, I think, a couple of things, because I'm thinking about still what you said about the chat, because I would just like to encourage all of our listeners to take your game up another level, right? Like, for example, back with the chat thing, if that's your preferred method, I would challenge you to be really good at verbal, get good at verbal, because these are the things that start to set people apart. And I think being authentic, on social media, is something that sets you apart. You'll see, this is my actual background. My home is sort of Santa Fe-ish. And, I would call if you had to define myself, I'd say urban rustic, like the houses. That's who I am. And I want to come across that way. But I always am on brand, professional and yet warm. And so, those are sort of the mix. So I think it's super important that people see you as on your brand, but you have to figure out, what is your brand?
Yeah. Can you talk to that a little bit? Because I think that is the number one challenge, right? Once we get it, it's pretty easy to start sorting it out if we're intentional. But how do you figure it out to begin with, Bonnie?
Well, it's a great question. So we're probably all about the same age, I'm guessing. I don't know. Maybe I'm a little older. But
35. Yeah.
But for us in our generations, when we came up, to get into corporate and to be, working at the top, we had to sort of act like men. And I mean, so initially going in out of college for us, we were like, okay, how do we get there? Well, I'm going to wear my hair short. I'm going to look with a suit on. So, I mean, honestly, I was trying to make sure that nobody recognized I was a woman, because it was that I didn't want it to be a distraction for where I was trying to go. Mm-hmm. But what's really cool is now we don't have to do that. Now we can be our authentic self. So where I used to have a long hair, but I wore it in a cut that I could actually hold it up so nobody could tell it was long. And where I'm going with all of this is just that now today, the young girls will say to me, I would never do that. I'm like, yeah, you can thank us, because we plowed the path for you so that you don't have to. But today I would not do that. I would wear, I'm going to wear my hair down because I'm a woman. I might wear a pink suit, but I'm going to wear something that's on brand.
I love the discussion on authenticity. And if you're jumping in and making a comment or a question and we don't address it, I promise that we will on the feed. Just before we started, I don't know if you can see the ceiling behind me. There's little stars that when you turn the lights off, they are fluorescent, because this used to be the baby room that we've turned into a guest room. And I'm okay with that. I'm okay with showing part of who I am. And I've very much guided quite a few friends that are LinkedIn instructors to say, I love your brand, but why don't you talk about your kids on the platform? You talk about the kids when we talk, you show me pictures. And I've seen several of instructors of LinkedIn start to step in a little bit of this, because that's part of your whole life. Back to the comment on the guitar, or back to the comment on other things that are part of your personal life when you go online, as long as, if you've done as a student, you have the record keg stands at your university, I wouldn't probably disclose that or put pictures of that. But if you go to a football game and you're at a tailgate and having fun with friends, or if you decide to attend something specific, put that in your overall picture of who you are. And I must say, not just LinkedIn, understand that the algorithm does not prefer words. It's back to what Brenda said. The algorithm is happy with images and meaningful images or video, and it's only going to get more and more like that specifically here. So I'm looking at I'm a little distracted of that on the online specific branding. We have,
another piece on the branding is that we evolve. So who I was 10 years ago is not an accurate representation of Brenda Bailey-Hughes today.
Mhm.
And so I think allowing ourselves that room to say, I have to tweak my brand. I mean, my authentic core may not change, but I have evolved as a person, and I know different things. I'm passionate about different things, and just giving ourselves that grace and space to evolve the brand as we evolve as people.
Yeah.
You know, if I could comment on that, I think that's an excellent point. And, you know, we change multiple times throughout our lives. And I have an actual real example, current. So in my company at EDA, we do custom executive development. We've been in business for 40 years. I'm transforming it into a tech company. So we're rolling out a major tech platform. So we'll still have services, but we'll be tech first. So in that transition, you know, I've had to learn to raise capital. I mean, it's really a whole nother ballgame.
Yeah.
And so the corporate person that I was always like the buttoned up high-end suit. Doesn't fit anymore because some of the VCs won't even talk to you if you show up in a suit. They're like, not you. And so I was like, you know, I had to rethink myself. Like, what is my brand going forward? And so I've come up with sort of a cross, which you can't really see, but I've got like jeans and boots on, and you know, it's like, but I still got the jacket.
Sure.
Yeah, but you're a tech entrepreneur now, which is a different role than corporate coach. That's a very different role, and you've evolved. Yeah,
and know your audience. This comment came in from Jigna, and I had the chance to read it before. She says, during an interview, how do you decide what to share about kids and personal and too hard to tell? My guess is that you're not in the United States, Jigna, because in the US, that is off the table as far as a discussion. They legally cannot ask you, and you share whatever you want and whatever you feel comfortable with. But my guess would be that you want to work for a company that hires the whole of you, doesn't just hire you as a worker and a performer without the kids and family situation that you have. And you get to decide how much you're willing to share, but you don't have to share any of that, I would say, from a specific legal standpoint. Now, on social media, and by the way, a lot of employers will go check out your LinkedIn profile before they ask you to talk to them or see you. And I keep telling our students and MBA students the same. You create your own brand. And that's why I thought it was important for us to share this. Let's finish off our fourth topic, which will probably be a stickier one or a standout one. I left it for last. What are, my friends, colleagues, some communication tips you have when it comes to dealing with difficult situations, either conflict with one person or with teams, either dealing with political issues in the workplace, either with just dealing with bias, anything that creates stickiness? What are your thoughts of what tips do you have for our learners? How do you want them to communicate? And let me take this first because we said we would rotate, so I would let you think about it a little bit more. And I will say this, that in our first reaction is to have an opinion and react or respond in a tricky situation. And as I've experienced many of these situations, the one thing that I've learned is to try to calm first my emotion and try to make sure that I don't have a bias, because if I've already made up my mind, it's not worth to even try to communicate. I need to try to be empathetic and see, where is this coming from? Or where is the person, what situation they're in, and they're acting in this way, or how is the situation progressing? And quite often I'll call people like Brenda or others in my trust circle and say, this is happening. Am I reading this? And I should do this before I communicate and react. Because every time I communicate quicker than something of this timing, I may not put my best self forward. So I would say my advice, my tip on communication is be empathetic and don't assume ill will right away in a conflict situation. I'll ask Bonnie or Brenda, jump in.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. So I was thinking about this. So I do CEO coaching, and so through the years, I work a lot on how to create safety and trust really fast. And so it's the same thing with conflict. So you can use these same skills. One is like you want to make it safe. So this first second you've realized they're trying to tell you something and it's probably not easy for them to say it. And so the second I realize someone's trying to say something that to me, I just turn that lens on to say to myself, okay, I need to make it safe. And so I'm listening, trying to hear what they have to say. And then I'll usually start, the first thing I'll say, flex is the word I want you to remember. Flex. Okay. So like, don't react, flex. So first thing I would say is like, let's say you said, well, you didn't do that right. You really screwed that up. And then, so let's say Brenda's telling me that. And I'm like, Brenda, I think you might be right. Let's talk about that.
Mm-hmm. You disarm her. She comes in with a punch.
I do not want her to be worried about the next thing she says.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm never going to get the good information. And being defensive is zero help. So forget about being defensive. You'll never get the right information. Just let it go. All you want to do is receive. Just so even in a really difficult conflict, like let's say you're having an argument with a peer or something, I would just totally lean back. Like, if someone said, well, that's my client. I'm like, you know what? Maybe it is. Let's go look at that.
Yeah.
And so even if you're not agreeing, you're holding space for the possibility that you could be wrong.
I'm just going to open up the possibility that they're right. And I'm never going to try to come back and say, I was right. Yeah. I might come back and say, let's look at it together.
Yeah.
And they might, if we look at it together, maybe I was right. So that we should come to that conclusion together. But I'm never going to try to push my agenda to say I was right, because it doesn't matter. I once heard a speech and the guy said, you can be right or you can be rich, but you can't be both. And it just sort of sticks in my mind like that. It doesn't help. It doesn't help at all to try to be right.
Yeah.
What helps is try to get to a good conclusion.
Well, I also think about how hard it is for me to sometimes build up my courage to give someone some tough feedback, knowing that others are probably experiencing that same reticence when they come to give me feedback, and all that research we've seen, Bonnie and Tatiana, I know you've read this on the higher you climb in the organization, the less real feedback you get, to the point that once you're at that CEO level, you can pretty much count on hardly anyone being honest with you. Yep. So I've always said that's a good thing about being in my position. I'm not the CEO, I'm not the chair, I'm not the president. That's good. I still get feedback, I guess. But so that when someone comes, I love that response of just, yeah, you know what, that might be right. Let's explore that. Just creating that safety. Mine was going to be still, I was going to say, like begin with appreciation. Thank you so much for coming to me with this. Thank you so much. I think I hadn't articulated it as well as you did, Bonnie, but it creates that safety. And then I think paraphrasing back what we're hearing is such an underutilized but powerful communication tool, that when we just summarize, okay, so here's what I heard you saying, that you think that client was yours, and this is why. It is disarming in a different way, because it says, I really heard you. Right. Maybe I agree, maybe I don't, we're not even there yet, but I at least heard you. I use that tech. You probably all got those people in your lives who tell you something and then they tell it to you again and they tell it to you again. And it's like they just won't get off of it. And I started framing that as it's because I haven't shown them that I've heard them. So they're just going to keep saying it until they break through. So when I paraphrase, I can literally see them physically go, yes.
I hear you. Yeah.
Thank you. That's what I meant.
Brenda, that's a great point, because when you get into an argument, people start yelling. It's because they don't think you're hearing them.
Listening. Yeah. We started with that.
Yes. Louder because you're not hearing me.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, interesting.
So I like that paraphrase. That's a great idea.
Our learner says here, not every difficult topic needs an immediate reaction. Matthew, for sure. It's part of, take a little bit of time, gather yourself. But when someone comes to you without saying, I want to give you a little feedback, when is the right time? At least you're prepared, versus being blindsided with someone delivering a whole tray of feedback that is hard to take. But again, that's when we take a deep breath and we say, thank you. I appreciate your perspective. Can we talk a little bit more about this?
I want to throw a monkey wrench into everything we just said, though, because for some of us who do struggle to be assertive, to say the hard things, sometimes I have to say it while I'm still just a little angry. I need a little bit of that fire to motivate me to be clear and to be honest. Yeah. And so sometimes I've learned to move with that emotion instead of, oh, I'll think about it for 3 weeks and get the wording just right. I will have talked myself out of it, and I will never say the hard thing. So sometimes I need to say it pretty close to in the moment. Now, I think there's a distinction, but if I'm going to be unclean about it and I'm going to be mean about it, then yes, I need to step out and get the emotion out of it. But Brenda, it's that motivating emotion. I need it some days.
But if you are in what we say, enough in an emotional bank account, I'm quoting the late legendary Stephen Covey, if the relationship has enough funds in the account, it's not going to close it. It takes a little bump down, but if there's enough there, you can connect. I wanted to bring up more. We could talk another hour for this. Rafa says, my team implemented feedback sessions on a regular basis. I find feedback sessions are most of what you need to do rather than what you are doing well. What can you improve and what you need to work on together? How do you get comfortable with situations like this when you're not used to settings like this? And communication here is hard. Rafaela, I'm guessing you're saying from a giving standpoint or from a receiving standpoint. And sessions like this, for me, don't do much to build the account because they only focus on things that need to change, that need to get better. Like, can we just carve a little bit of time to praise the person and say, you've crushed it on this. I see your effort on this. Maybe the organization needs to not just cut to the chase and focus just on all of this stuff that needs to happen. And my other suggestion to you would be to practice this and have someone watch you go through it so that they can give you feedback on how you're doing.
Right. Buy everybody in your office copies of books like Strength-Based Leadership and just slide it into their inboxes anonymously. Let's see what happens.
I love that specifically. Well, our time, again, I try hard to stay under the 60-minute time frame. And my last question for all of us to share is, how do you practice those skills of being a stellar communicator? How do you look outside of the work that you do every day and try to continue to flex that muscle? What suggestions would you have to our friends?
It's a great question because it's kind of like you're on the dance floor and you're dancing, but at the same time, you need to be up on the balcony watching yourself dancing because I'm communicating, but that's when I need to observe myself. I make notes in my calendar of certain things, certain communication skills I'm working on. So if I know I really want to work on paraphrasing more, and I've got 3 meetings in the next couple of days, I jot a note to myself, paraphrase, right in the notes for the meeting as sort of this constant reminder of what I want to do. So that would be one of my strategies, I guess, just making really concrete notes in my calendar.
One of the things that I do is, in an effort to gather a lot of information and try to regurgitate it back in my head. I don't speak it, but if someone said, so what's the bottom line? I always write notes and I try to come up with sort of what's the theme of our conversation, or what's the highlight of this person? What are they saying? Up to 3 words. And I may just write it in notes. It helps me listen and process a lot better, but it also helps me sharpen my conciseness skills. What about you, Bonnie?
Well, one thing I would say is just education and training. Like, I've probably read 100 books on communication, conflict, communication, negotiations, all of that stuff. I have taken 7 speaking trainings and had 2.
You have a coach.
And 2 speaking coaches, one of which I continue to have. I never do a speech without a session with my coach. Mm-hmm. And, just that continuous education and forcing yourself to be videoed, to get the feedback, to hear how you're coming across. I mean, if you're going to do something, I believe in doing it well. And it's sort of like, I use this analogy a lot in my teaching, which is sports. You know, if you're an athlete, when you go to practice, you practice fundamentals.
Mhm.
Very rarely are you practicing that really unique move or, you know, something different. Most of the time, you're practicing the basics. Communication is a basic, and mastering it will make you start to stand out, move up. And I'll tell you another thing, being great at dealing with conflict will cause you to rise immediately.
Wow.
Because it's people see you shine and take care of people and
so many
solve
people
situations.
avoid it.
In your Leading with Vision course, I go back, I watched that course. Bonnie, you talk about the basketball players doing
Yes.
500 free throw shots a day before school as they practice. And it's so true. It's a skill that you need constantly. Some of you know, and a lot of our learners are from all over the world because I get to attract the non-English speakers. For me, when I first came to this country, I coached swimming. I coached kids how to swim, and it was something I needed to do for money. But I also realized that it helped me be assertive, helped me learn how to speak in short sentences that got attention, to speak up and to be okay listening to my accent and be comfortable with that. And look at me now. I think I can say I'm pretty legible, and I look back in those days that may have been pretty tough, but find something that you will go back and practice all of this as you are. Sylvia, great to see you, my friend.
You know, that reminds me, let me say one thing about that, Tatiana. So some of you remember, you know, Ronald Reagan, our past president, he learned to be a speaker by being a spokesperson for GE. He had to go to all these little towns and he had to talk for them. And so that actually helped him to be a great politician because he got out there and learned all these people. You know, he'd go to like little plants and he'd talk to the individual workers and he'd learn about them.
Sure.
And so he would connect. And so like you're saying, like find a way to make yourself practice, whatever it is, something in your community, something with your family. That's really cool.
And don't underestimate it, as we say. So as we finish, I started by saying that when your skills are in demand, you are in demand. And communication is one of those top skills that are visible, that make you shine, that make you stand out. And in our discussion here today, we wanted to make sure that you leverage some of the learning points that you heard us share. We'll come up with some tips. We'll respond to a lot of the suggestions or questions that you shared in the feed today. This has been recorded so you can share it with your friends. But thank you so much from sunny Bloomington, Indiana, where Brenda and I are, and Bonnie coming in from
Kansas City.
Kansas City. We want to say a big, big thank you, heartfelt thank you, and have a great rest of your evening and or your day. Bye-bye.